Welcome to the studios of SaharaTV. Today we have with us our one and lovely comrade, Comrade Dagger Tola. Welcome to the studio, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sir, we are here to ask you about June 12, your perspective on June 12, and moreover, the democracy, the Nigerian democracy as a whole. That's the purpose of you being in the studio today. So the first question goes to us like, what is your perspective on the June 12, 1993 elections?
Well, let me begin that we, as socialists, we don't queue behind those who try to create the false impression and illusion that the June 12th election, was the best and freest of all of that. Of course, within the context of the struggle against military dictatorship, we must not forget that as socialists, we boycotted the elections. A majority of Nigerians also didn't vote in that election, but it was significant that 14 million Nigerians voted, and placing the result of that election side by side with a continuation of military dictatorship, the voice of 14 million was far greater than the jackboots and guns of the Babangida regime. So it is within this context that the June 12th plays an important epochal role in the struggle of the mass of the working people against military dictatorship. Wow. It's also important to place all of the resistance that emerged following the subsequent annulment of the election by the Babangida regime as a clear documentation of the willingness of the working masses in this part of the world to resist military dictatorship. And indeed, the Babangida regime was chased out of power on the 26th of August 1993. Of course, he offered history the phrase stepping aside. In reality, it was a series of struggle of the mass of the working people on the streets, the series of general strikes, that compelled and forced the regime with no other choice than to step aside. So if we are to begin to list the significance of that, first and foremost is the fact that Nigerians have demonstrated the ability that they can organize themselves, they can mobilize themselves, they can come together and struggle against a dictatorial regime. And for a military regime that had to chase, that had to, in the middle of the night, run away from power, it shows the heroic possibilities of all of those struggles. But unfortunately for all of us, that movement itself lack a clear revolutionary leadership to take the logical movement to its logical conclusion.
Comrade, well said, sir. In terms of the electoral conduct and fairness, how do you see June 12 election in terms of the conduct and fairness? Because a lot of people used to say that, is the most free and fair election that has been conducted in Nigeria so far. So what's your take on this?
I must say that first there was the pressure to bring an end to military dictatorship. So for a majority of people, going out to cast their vote was directly a vote for the military rule to come to an end. And like the election result itself made quite clear, 40 million Nigerians voted. So that first and foremost is the first verdict, that we must hold upon, that 14 million Nigerians came out, representing the millions of other Nigerians, that military dictatorship must come to an end. So within that context, compared to all other elections, even in this Fourth Republic, there is a sense in which that had more greater participation than all other elections till date. Okay,
very, very good, comrade. Very good. Where were you on the date of the annulment of June 12, 1993 election? When were you? When the election was announced by Babangida's military regime?
Now, the question of our location, particularly in material history, is not greater, it's not more important than what type of reaction, that we took or people were involved in immediately the election was announced. Don't forget, as socialists, we didn't vote in that election, we didn't partake in the election. But it was significant that a majority of all of us, as socialists, as activists, provided, the fulcrum to resist the annulment of that particular election. The moment the election was annulled, the first signal that was sent out was that the regime wanted by all means, don't forget, there had been the 1992 elections, where primaries were conducted, and the regime cancelled all of these elections and now decided to set up political parties for Nigerians, two political parties for Nigerians, the NRC and the SDP. They had, series of antics by the Babangida regime, demonstrating clearly to all. Others had referred to all of these antics as the hidden agenda of the Babangida regime to continue to perpetuate itself in power. So with the annulment of the election, the signal, that it sent to clear conscious working class activists in the part of the country was the unwillingness of the regime, to relinquish power, and the necessity and need to organize resistance against that attempt to continue military dictatorship in Nigeria.
Oh, comrade, there were stories about how endangered pro-democracy activists sneaked out of into exile through what is known as the Nadeko route. Could you tell us about the journey into exile during that period?
Let me begin that I do not find myself in one of those ranks that left the country. We were here. We were in the series of movements, beginning from the very first movement of July 5. And I'm happy that as socialists, the campaign for democracy, which first gave the clarion call for mass movement at that material moment in time, that our organization, an organization that I was part and parcel of the democratic socialist movement then, agitated that as opposed to a candlelight vigil in the residence of MK Abiola at Okwebi, that the CD should come to the forefront and call a mass movement. And today, we are beneficiaries of the success of that call, because July 5, 1993 became the very first basis in modern day political history of Nigeria of the mass of the entirety of working people building a massive resistance, for democracy and end for military dictatorship in this part of the world. Of course, that movement continued all through July, through August, and like we have pointed out, forcing the regime to make an immediate retreat. The movement was not immediately now strong enough to replace the exit of the regime with an Abiola government, but successfully Babangida regime had to chase itself out of power, handed over to an interim regime. And with the interim regime of Shonekan coming to power, Nigerians again continued the struggle against this regime for the validation of June 12. And I think significant for people like us is the entire role the working class and the trade union movements played in all of this series of struggle. Because when we mention pro-democracy activists, we ignore the fact that the trade unions were also at the forefront of this movement. Nupeng, led by Kokori, Pegasin, the major key sectors of the economy. When the Pascal Bafayu led NLC was no longer willing to provide leadership for the entirety of the working class, this section of the trade union movements came into the forefront, leading Nigerians to organize general strikes, both in the oil sector as a basis of pressure against the regime. So more importantly than heaping praise on so-called elephant Nadeko pro-democracy activists, our documentation of history should go to all of the millions of working class activists, hundreds of youths that were killed, that were shot on the street in July 5, on the streets, in a place like mainland. Somebody like Idowu Awokpeju was killed. A lot of other undocumented, hundreds of youths, working class youths in all parts of the country were shot and killed. We must challenge ourselves as events go, as part of documenting the June 12 movement, to document and bring the names of all of these unknown class fighters for democracy into the forefront and begin to honor them for the huge sacrifice and price they paid for the current bourgeois democracy that we currently have.
Thank you, comrade. During this period of struggle, were you ever arrested?
Obviously, the majority of all of us were arrested and detained. And I happen to be one of those two who were arrested and detained, giving a second call, for mass movement, in August, in the country. Our involvement, not just in the CD movement, but as organizers of the labor militant, which became the DSM, subsequently, to organize the resistance in various communities and in various workplaces. We turned out to have been one of those who were arrested. But our arrest and detention pales into insignificance. What should be noted is the fact that in this struggle, people died. And unfortunately, we have not appropriately documented and give the appropriate honor and prestige to all of these people who paid the ultimate price for democracy. Of course, it's important to know that MKO Abiola himself, died, paid huge price. The wife was assassinated. Members of the family were harassed persistently, to the very last point, that all of his businesses and concerns in the countries were crushed by the military regime in power. We must not dismiss all of these huge sacrifice, but at the same time, we as socialists want to pay premium price to the sacrifice placed, to the inspiring role played by working class youths in the various communities and workplaces in all parts of the country in 1993 through to 1999.
Comrade, fast forward to June 6, 2018. President Muhammadu Buhari shocked a lot of Nigerians when you heard about the decision that June 12 was actually the new Democracy Day, which was formally May 29. What was your first thoughts when the president uttered the statement? What came through your mind?
Now, let me clearly state that there is no way that act can entirely dismiss the fact that Buhari and all his all his co-fellow travelers, supported and endorsed the annulment. We must not easily forget that the Buhari regime, was part of the Abacha regime, even if it's only in relation to his managing the Petroleum Trust Fund. And from that kind of participatory role, it's in itself an endorsement, of the annulment, given the entire role the Abacha regime played and the disaster it constituted, to the growth and development of Nigeria. The pronouncement of June 12th as a Democracy Day, could only directly have been connected to the attempt by the Buhari regime to chunk up its level, at the coming of the general elections last year, as a basis to gain populist sentiment in this part of the country. We must recognize that the import of a Democracy Day actually do not lie in the making of a holiday like we have it today. All of the holidays that we have had in the past period, how has this made any significant difference, in the life of the mass of the working people? The millions of people, 40 million people that came out to vote in June 12th, they voted with clear demands in their mind. And what were those demands? They wanted a change in their social economic conditions. They didn't just vote for an end of military rule. They voted for a type of democracy that will mean a basis of beginning to transforming their lives. But if you look at what has happened these past 20 years of civil rule, practically the living conditions of the mass of the working people, they are far worse off than you can ever imagine. The debt profile of the country has grown to a figure of 33 trillion naira. And with the dollar rates increasing, with the huge debt profile and the huge devaluation that has taken place, with dollar going for over 400 naira, the debt profile again will increase. Nigerians cannot just easily forget that we are still yet in the woods of the series of economic policies from the military regime of Babangida through the social adjustment program, through the deregulation program, up till date. The pains, the penuries of all of these pangs of failed policies of economic development that themselves are the basis of underdeveloping the Nigerian economy. That Nigerians have continued to suffer all of those pains. So where are the gains of a Democracy Day? The celebration of a Democracy Day holiday should be in the fact that Nigerians are happy. And there can be no better basis to see the huge failure of this bourgeois experiment at democracy, than in the recent lockdown that Nigerians have had to suffer, or in the pandemic that the whole world has had to, as we speak now, over 7 million people have died worldwide. Now, if you compare that to the figure in Nigeria of the numbers of deaths, you can firstly draw the conclusion that things are working in this country. But the truth is that the lockdown and the pandemic, again, are basis to demonstrate the entire failure of the Buhari regime. This is after 5 years of, the regime is already spending 2/3 of its tenure of 8 years in government. And clearly, with the lockdown, Nigerians were able to see that there are more people in poverty than even existing statistics clearly demonstrated. And don't forget that we're already in a recession. This country is permanently in a recession. The shutdown of the economy these past 2-3 months again has affected a new crisis in the economy, not only in terms of shortage of taxable income, but more largely from the shortfall of oil revenue that the regime are supposed to have collected. Again, Nigerians are not in any form surprised, because this oil revenue, if that truly come in, they were not going to be instruments of development of the Nigerian economy, of the social upliftment of the mass of the working people. But it is significant to note that conditions are getting worse, and that both the micro and macroeconomic policies of the regime are clear indications that this whole issue around the democracy day is clearly an illusion to deceive and create pretense among the mass of the people that the regime is practically or has achieved anything since it came into power in 2015.
Thank you very much, comrade. The last and the final question for today. We can't, if we keep talking about this, it's just going to be, the whole day. So, do you think Nigeria would have been a better country if the June 12 elections was not annulled?
Now, let me say, history has never been about if. So, as speculative as that will be, we do not share any illusion in the fact that the MKO Abiola regime itself will have based itself on a new capitalist economy. But it is significant for all of us to note that, or pose the question, why did the Babangida regime annul that election? The election was annulled, not from the point of view that they hated Abiola. It was clearly from the class position that the regime was not confident enough that all of the populist illusion that the Hope 93 campaign had sold in the mass of the working people, and that when huge movement break out among the Nigerian working masses to demand for these fruits of democracy, that those pressures will not be enough to force the Abiola regime, to move from a right-wing shift, either to a reformist wing, to granting some of all of these expectations of the mass of the people. And not granted, the regime was clearly mortally afraid of the fact that a mass movement will arise. With a Buhari, with an Abiola regime in power, and that it might not be capable of holding the shoulders of the ruling elites collectively together. This, for me, are greater reasons and greater fears of the regime why the election was annulled. But in going forward and in ending this discourse, it's important to say that, yes, there are obvious advantage of bourgeois democracy over outright military dictatorship. But this obvious advantage are made nonsense of by a new capitalist, economy. And that it's important to draw Nigerians to clearly understanding that as bad and wrong as military dictatorship is and was, that the mortal danger that confronts all of us is not whether a regime is military or a regime is civilian. It's the nature of how the economy is organized, for whose interest, who owns the resources and wealth of Nigeria. And that is what has not changed since 1960 till date. A tiny section of Nigeria, before the independence, the British colonialists lorded themselves over the entirety of the economy of the country. With independence, a tiny sections of Nigerians who are littered in all the ethnic nationalities, have continued their monopolic hold over the entire resources of the country. And this is where we must say that we must draw inspirations from the series of struggles of Nigerians against the annulment of the June 12th. Beat our chest and tell ourselves that we can garner lessons from ourselves through all of the beauties of all of those movements, through the role of the working class in the success of those movements, and see how we can build a mass-based working class movement that will be led by the mass of the working class, putting forward clear socialist ideas that will ensure that education can be free in this country, agriculture can be transformed, industries can be built, housing and all of the necessary things that will make life better for all of us can be built. All of these are possible, are achievable on the basis of the huge resources and wealth of the country. But first and foremost, there is a need, to demand, that Nigerians must grow their spirit of agitation. If the Buhari regime wants Nigerians to applaud it, first, for its role and support for the annulment of the June 12th election, given its role in participation in the Abacha regime, and secondly, for the fact that it has betrayed the series of hopes that the majority of Nigerians falsely and elusively placed on it. The only thing it can do for us, for Nigerians to celebrate Buhari, is for this government to resign immediately. Because after about 5 years plus in power, it has demonstrated that it is incapable of confronting all of the issues. Even the Buhari, if Buhari of 93 were to resurrect and confront today's Buhari, I'm quite sure that today's Buhari himself will be aghast and be ashamed of his performance in government. So I want to round up by saying that there can be no greater gift for democracy to blossom and grow in this part of the country than for the Buhari regime to publicly come out, apologize for its role in the annulment of the June 12th, apologize for having failed, to transform our lives or to end our mysteries. And of course, we are going to applaud if it is bold enough to resign from this government and give Nigerians an opportunity to put in place a government that will defend its interests, that will begin to transform life for the mass of the working people. Of course, I'm not also deceived that can only be achieved successfully through the growth of a mass revolutionary movement whose aims and goals ultimately will be the socialist transformation of Nigeria.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. Yes.